welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Garren Mulloy, who will be presenting on the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the JSDF. Just a kind reminder to refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. Dr. Garren Mulloy is a professor in the Faculty of International Relations and Graduate School of Asia Area Studies at Daito Bunka University in Saitama, Japan. His research has focused primarily upon Japanese security, having completed a PhD on Japan's self-defense forces overseas operations at Newcastle University. And he has written on contemporary defense, security, diplomacy, related issues, as well as historical studies of Japan, the UK, and war memorialization. His book, Defenders of Japan, the Post-Imperial Armed Forces, 1946 to 2016, A History, combines historical and IR approaches. To read more about Dr. Mulloy's research, please find his extended biography on the YCAP's website. Dr. Mulloy, thank you once again for joining us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Amani. And also, I'd like to say before I begin, thank you to everyone at YCAPS, Amani in particular, been coordinating with, but with Jeff and Gabriella and everyone else. YCAPS is a wonderful community that I hope everyone who is a newcomer will embrace and join more of the events. So we're going to start with Japan Self-Defense Forces, Get to Know Japan. So what I'm going to do is two things. The first thing is, as I've done before, to basically give a background to how the self-defense forces were founded, what's the foundation, how they developed, and how they are somewhat different from other forces and how they fit into Japan in terms of policy, society, and culture. But I'm going to particularly emphasize the second part, which is bringing you up to date, essentially beyond what my book gives, to bring you up to date, essentially to talk about the present and the future challenges that the forces face. So if we could have the next slide, please. Great. So essentially, who are the forces? Why are they? What are the future? And there are 9 sections. I know it looks rather foreboding, but a lot of these are short. I'm going to go through them rather quickly. But particularly from part 6, present duties, 7, future roles, capabilities, and 8, the challenges. That's where the second half of the presentation will be focused. And the next slide, please. Okay, and this is the book that Amani referred to. It came out a couple of years ago, and the structure here is very simple of the book, very simple indeed. And I hope it is of some interest to some people, but I'm not going to plug it too much because, you know, not everyone wants to buy a book. And the next slide, please. And essentially what we're looking at here is the forces before the JSDF. JSDF were founded in 1954. So the forces existed from 1954, but obviously from the end of the war, Japan demobilized, but there was not complete deactivation. Japanese forces, they were called Japan Surrendered Personnel, were deployed in combat roles by the British in what we now call Indonesia. And IGA units continued fighting in China, particularly on the side, of course, of the nationalists. And there were 3 categories of soldiers and sailors who held out, as it were. They were the holdouts, those people who just didn't know the war had ended or didn't want to believe it. The idealists who rather believed in Japan's imperial vision for Asia. And the fugitives, those who feared prosecution by the Allies and therefore went underground. And these people had very varying end stories, which I won't go into in any detail. But the most important thing is that the Imperial Japanese Navy, under different names, continued minesweeping under the occupation authorities around Japan and later in Korea. And next slide, please. So the forces before the SDF, essentially you've got the Maritime Safety Agency, which was the continuation of the Navy, but doing, you know, anti-smuggling, patrolling, minesweeping, very much civilian constabulary duties we associate with the Coast Guard. The National Police Reserve was founded, and that was essentially the precursor to the Ground Self-Defense Force. But very importantly, 1950, it was founded as a police reserve with a large-scale internal security brief. national safety forces and the coastal safety forces were the sort of segue towards founding what we would call military forces. But you must understand that the forces in this period of 50 to 54 were neither completely military nor completely, they were completely civilian, but they were not just purely like normal police forces we have today. They were something else. So this is the vague area where some people get confused that Japan had long-term plans to refound a great army. That's not necessarily the case, but certainly Japan had plans to have some sort of force. And if we have the next slide, please, we'll see that the reason for this was primarily due to the Korean War. And the Korean War deployments were primarily naval, and the Japanese casualties were greatly underestimated. They were rather kept from the Japanese people. But most importantly, for the context of this story, it's about the minesweeper that was lost, and a US Army tugboat was lost, which actually killed more people. And the huge numbers of Japanese sailors who operated what were ex-US Navy LST ferries, as you can see in the right-hand picture, that made possible the landings at Incheon. Ishimaru has estimated that approximately 8,000 Japanese served in and around Korea, and it's estimated by Kimura that about 381 of them were killed. Not a happy experience at all for Japan. Next slide, please. So we get to 1954, and it's clear that with the end of the American occupation, with the experience of the Korean War, with worries about internal stability, Japan needed to essentially standardize both its police and its Coast Guard forces and the other forces. So we have the foundation of the National Police Agency, the Maritime Safety Agency, and the Defense Agency, with other agencies supporting them. And of course, we have 3 self-defense forces that were founded, whereas previously the Japanese military had only the ground and the naval forces. So they were founded in 1954. Next slide, please. So we get Cold War developments, and the big developments are budget. Now, a lot of people assume that Japan spent very little money because this idea of the Yoshida Doctrine, that Japan focused primarily on its economic growth, which is correct. However, the budget during the first 10 years of the SDF was a significant percentage of public spending. In the 50s, it was something like 15% of the total government budget. This was a major item that they were spending money on. Recruitment was large scale, of course, procurement, and there was, in the early days, close cooperation and coordination with US forces Japan, but the progression towards defensive independence, which probably wasn't achieved really until the late 80s. But it was a gradual process. But what did happen during the Cold War, there were crisis points. 1960, the renewal of the Security Treaty. 76, the top picture on the right there is a MiG-25 that landed at Hakodate. It's called the Belenko incident, and there's a newspaper heading from that. In 1981, Prime Minister Suzuki and his declaration with President Reagan about Japan expanding its sea lane defense, which happened in a very ad hoc and uncoordinated manner. All of these crisis points led to progression in development, not only of the forces themselves, but also how they were considered. So Nakasone in the late 80s had this dream of a genuine defense capability, which he helped to realize, but there was also a defense nightmare. The 3 self-defense forces had 3 very separate and almost uncoordinated plans to defend Japan, which led to problems of joint working later. Next slide, please. And we've got post-Cold War development, and primarily, the strangest thing is that there was little adjustment to the end of the Cold War in terms of budget or force posture. There was no peace dividend for Japan. The procurement and budget inflation continued until 1998. But with the Gulf War crisis, it was seen Japan must act. Primarily, they were talking about sending troops or units or some sort of force to the Gulf. But obviously what happened was they sent a minesweeping team after the Gulf War, which did good work. But primarily the overseas deployments of Japanese troops have been in peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, HADR, efforts. So essentially, the JSDF as peace servants. The narrative quickly shifted from them being sent overseas. People saw this as a reversion to some sort of wartime identity. They were seen as international liberal peace servants and actors. And particularly for human security issues, both domestically and overseas, natural disasters were the key part of their work, but other parts as well. And also regional threats to security from DPRK, increasingly in the 90s from China, but also terrorism and piracy. Next slide, please. And as for the place in society and culture, policy and law, there's a modulating position of the forces, as will become apparent, as I'm sure most of you will know. The disaster relief work that the forces carried out throughout their history made them popular. The big change, of course, it wasn't as big a change as perhaps it seems now, but in 2011 with the tsunami in Tohoku, this was a major change because the forces were mobilized to a greater extent than they had been since the Japanese military in 1945. And they became embedded with the Japanese people in those affected areas to a greater extent than any forces had in peacetime. The national culture and the force culture were very much regarding the forces as not equivalent to military forces of other countries. But there was a great degree of policy irresponsibility regarding the forces, as in the development of 3 quite independent defense plans, which moved on into the Cold War. The forces were trying to develop separately with very little joint coordination by the forces or by policy leaders. And always legal issues remain as the albatross around the neck of the forces, because there are questions about their legitimacy, which leads us to other things. We will have the next slide, please, if that's all right. And most of this, of course, is based on the Constitution, which most of you know, but the parts which are highlighted here, clearly, Japan forever announces war as a sovereign right, and land, sea, and air forces as other war potential will never be maintained. And yet the self-defense forces as military forces exist. It's interesting to note that most Japanese people probably want to keep the Constitution in roughly the same sort of form as it is now. And yet most Japanese people are also quite fine with the forces as they are now. It seems like a dilemma from the outside, but within Japan, these things have become normalized. Next slide, please. And I'm highlighting here 3 works by other authors, which I strongly recommend people to read for different reasons. But there were major shifts in JSDF and security evaluations for Japan. The legitimacy defects of the SDF were being addressed. Performance and utility, the question marks, but they were being addressed. But the big change was in Japan's assessment of its own risk environment. The environment that Japan was in, entering the 21st century, was very different to what it was in the Cold War, much less predictable in many ways. There was a major shift in perceptions of the duties of the forces, looking at national, regional, and global issues, and also the transformative effects of Operation Tomodachi, for example, and other domestic HADR. But there was a slow shift in budgets, which, again, what we tend to think about in terms of IR theory. Realism doesn't really fit Japan regarding the budgets for much of this time. Increases to 1998, then a slow decline until 2013, slight increases then, and then from last year, rapid rises, an announcement of almost doubling the defense budget, significant increase in the Japan Coast Guard budget as well. And yet, society seems to be generally fine with this, but very few people, despite the fact that the JSDF evaluations are often positively evaluated by more than 90% of people, very few people are interested in serving in the forces. Since the 1960s, that figure has been about 5%. There are shallow reserves of manpower, or personnel rather, and a shrinking youth. So if that 5% remains constant, that's a hugely reduced pool of potential candidates. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here are the present duties. So obviously they have remained constant for much of their life. Disaster relief is a major one. Law and order is a background one, which has never been implemented. But the big one, of course, is contingencies. That's all support to the civil power. Of course, national defense, national security, a core aim of the core duty of the SDF. But increasingly, it's being merged with regional defense and security, and the line between regional and national defense and security is increasingly blurred. If we just look at the example of the Senkaku Islands and their proximity to Taiwan and the issues of Taiwan security, this is a good illustration of this effort, as you can see on the map. But also there's been increasing merging of the sense of the global alliance and particularly the alliance with the United States, which isn't just a defense of Japan alliance, it is becoming increasingly a global alliance, but also Japan's partnerships, not just the regional partnerships within Asia, but a partnership, the strongest partnership is with Australia. And after that, possibly with European powers such as the UK and France. And increasingly, Japan is using the free and open Indo-Pacific, the FOIP, as a catch-all umbrella within which to place its diplomatic, military, civil, aid, trade, every possible policy to engage Asia and the world is being put under FOIP, which will come back further on in the presentation. And the next slide, please. So the future roles and capabilities of the forces. We've got, obviously, as in with all military and civilian institutions, they're increasingly looking at cyber issues, cyber defense, cyber security. Space. Japan had a peaceful use of space law, which was changed in approximately 2006. And Japan is, particularly for surveillance satellites and communications, is looking increasingly at space. And one of the reasons is, of course, that Japan has lacked information, intelligence capabilities. It tended to be a consumer of intelligence provided by particularly the United States, but it needs to and has become a much more capable independent generator, but still with problems of capabilities. It has developed multi-domain and rapid deployment forces, particularly the amphibious ready deployment brigade. But its ability to conduct joint and combined operations, despite great advances and despite a lot of training and effort put in, there are still issues regarding joint and combined working. And also, although the capability has grown, sustainability issues persist. And Japan has invested a great deal and is continuing to invest a great deal of its increased budget in strategic shield and strike capabilities. So ballistic missile defense originally was going to be Aegis ashore. It's now going to be Aegis at sea, a continuation of capabilities it already has, together with cruise missiles and other forms of missiles for strike capabilities. What Japan is trying to do is to develop strategic conventional weapons as a deterrent force, which is a logical development of everything else, but it does leave some questions and gaps. One of the gaps is the political cognition gap. Are civilian leaders suitably educated about what a deterrent force is and a strategic force is, and the dangers of potentially using that in a tactical scenario and what messages that could give to a potential foe? But the forces are not just concerned with these greatly kinetic, war-framed contingencies. They're also looking at a great deal of non-traditional military contingencies, such as the effects of climate change, and in particularly within Japan, depopulation, and how the forces are increasingly being used to manage those. And we see the situation in the Noto Hanto at the moment with the Ishikawa earthquake from New Year's Day, that a lot of this isn't just earthquake relief, it is trying to manage the fact that the local communities are very old. And this job is only going to increase. And the next slide, please. And part of the problem that Japan has in terms of its own defense and security is looking at what the future roles will be. Now, peace operations, Japan withdrew after 2016 because of the crisis with South Sudan. It seems unlikely they're going to go back to that because I don't think they regard those operations as likely to bring them any sense of advantage. HADR operations probably will be increasing because climate change dictates that domestically and overseas, there are going to be more contingencies. And in this area, Japan is something of a superpower, a hadro superpower. But when we look at national defense and regional or broader defense, we have to look at what is being defended potentially, who is being defended or who is doing the defending, and where this might occur. Now, obviously, East China Sea with the Senkaku Islands, the top right diagram shows, this is from the Ministry of Defense homepage, the way that Japan has become more mobile with deploying its forces towards the southwestern islands, the Nansei Shoto, the island chain that runs between essentially the southwestern tip of Kyushu and towards Taiwan. But the Taiwan issue increasingly, once this was a taboo issue for Japan to consider, but that's no longer the case. Japan's policy on Taiwan has probably transformed more than any other country's policy on Taiwan. American policy has shifted, but Japan's policy has transformed because it was a non-subject and now it is a subject. But there are broader questions, and I put the map there showing the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And I think this is prescient because Japan is very concerned naturally about the security of its shipping passing through these straits. But one of the problems that Japan has is trying to identify what is Japanese shipping. Because there are vessels which are not Japanese flagged and they're not Japanese crewed, but they are owned or leased by Japanese companies, and some of the cargo will be Japanese. And this is a problem facing many countries. What actually constitutes your national shipping resources? And what responsibilities do you have for that shipping? And what responsibilities do you have for the crew, which are often not of your country's nationality? But clearly, there's also a strong link between what's happening towards West Asia and the issues pertaining to the South China Sea. And everything on the South China Sea, of course, relates to China and also issues of the Western Pacific. And Japan has no claims in the South China Sea, but it could very easily be drawn into any form of dispute or even conflict. And the next slide, please. And of course, the panda in the room, we don't tend to talk about too much, but yes, we do actually, but policymakers try not to talk about it too much, is Japan's efforts at geostrategic risk management, essentially of China. North Korea obviously presents challenges for Japan, but China is the main challenge. So we've had Senkaku confrontations from 2010, increased Chinese incursions in Japanese waters, increased investments in the Nansei Shoto Islands, which are listed on this map, either new bases or enhanced bases. We've got US-based proximity and density issues, the proximity of Taiwan, the Luzon Straits, which are the major passageway between the South and East China Seas. And this is an extremely tough safety and security management task for the forces and for the Japan Coast Guard. And there is continuing US alliance dependency, but also increasingly the sense that Japan has got partnerships which are also stakeholders in these potential conflicts. So this is no longer a Japan domestic national security or defense issue. It's become a much broader issue. And this is where the merging of these different areas is most significant. Next slide, please. So we've got the challenges here of the geostrategic problems and some of the solutions that Japan cannot change its neighborhood. And frankly, it's a bit of a rough neighborhood. We've got China, we've got North Korea, and we've got Russia, which are usually either hostile or at least very cool in their relations. South Korea is presently cooperative with Japan, very much so, the most cooperative administration in decades. But often relations with Korea are cool or even bordering on hostile. With Taiwan, Japan has warm relations, but it is the hinge of troubled seas and of US-China frictions. So diplomatic solutions are generally placed under the FOIP umbrella. And of course, for Japan, the most important diplomatic, and well, the keystone of everything is the US alliance. But the partnerships, the broad range of partnerships and the diverse range of partnerships have become increasingly important, not least with two partners, India and particularly Australia, who are members of the Quad. Now, Japan has traditionally had functional engagement with many countries across Asia. using its ODA and trade and cooperation, but now it's also got its official security assistance as well. And Japan is continuing to use these devices very well, I must say, under the very flexible but somewhat vague banner of FOIP. But the defense solutions require a little bit more examination. 3 documents came out in December 2022, the National Security Strategy, the second one, the first National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Augmentation Plan, also called the Defense Build-Up Plan. Now, this greatly enhanced contingency planning, which people like me, commentators like myself, have said were inadequate. And it's gone beyond previous possibilities and greatly enhanced the support given to logistical work, medical work, for example, having prepared medical facilities, having medical personnel earmarked to move to these, and having enhanced like blood bank supplies and plasma supplies. And also infrastructure support, using civilian infrastructure in training, not just saying, oh, we might use it in time of conflict. And of course, the big one, as I previously said, is the increased transfer of JSDF to the Southwestern Islands and mobility of forces to be moved there should the need arise. And the next slide, please. Well, we have outstanding challenges, and the biggest outstanding challenge is to try and sustain the forces as they are. Essentially, the problem is there aren't enough people. There simply are not enough people. And the graph on the right side, I know it's in Japanese, so apologies. This shows the difference of 1990 to 2017. The blue color towards the bottom are those enlisted personnel in the lowest ranks. And it's by age range, going up from age of 15, which is just students in school, up to 60. So as you can see, the huge difference between 1990 and 2017 is that the number of young people who serve in the lowest ranks and then would rise up through the ranks has massively diminished. So what you're getting now is a force, and the situation now is even more extreme. You're getting a force now where there are very few younger people, and the majority of the forces are older. The average age rises, and this leads to major problems. There are also problems with logistical lift. Now, this should be easily solved, but there are issues there, and of course, intelligence capability. But Japan faces a more important sustainability issue with the sense of its economic power. Does Japan have the economic power to sustain an increased defense budget? Japan, possibly today, in dollar terms, certainly, is the #4 economy. I mean, we all remember when Japan was going to be #1. Sorry, the older people here do. But it's now #4. But also there are issues about Japan's willingness socially and politically to accept risk. And this is linked with the legal legacies of society, culture, and doctrine, which Japan has tended to view the forces within a very limited legal framework and therefore a very limited scope for them being put in positions of risk. And there are also continuing intra-force issues about joint combined operations and the importance of tempo, which I know US forces are particularly conscious of. So if we could have the next slide, please. This brings us to a conclusion. I'm sorry if the conclusion seems a little long-winded and broad-ranging, but the JSDF are greatly shaped, the culture of the forces and how they operate is greatly shaped by their less military roles from their foundation, their constabulary roots, sorry about the chime, the foundation roots, but also the fact that they are major domestic and international civilian actors, civilian style actors in terms of securing human security in times of conflict or disaster. But also they're shaped greatly by the US alliance and by their social perception within Japan. And the social perception, of course, has changed. The forces themselves have changed too. And it looks as though the forces have changed very gradually. But when you look at it, they often change dramatically. The move overseas seemed to come slowly and then it moved very quickly. The increase of budget, other things. It's like many things in Japan. It doesn't seem to change and then suddenly it has changed. You're like, oh, how did that happen? Great expansion of the roles, internal and external, human and international security roles, limited expansion of risk acceptance, I think, is continuing, and that's not a bad thing. But also there's a limited expansion of the political lead in defense planning. It is tended to be left up to the uniformed personnel to plan these things, which when we talk about civilian control, it seems to be the political leaders want to have civilian control, but not civilian responsibility so much. The JSDF are reliable HADR partners, but will they be regarded as reliable regional and global security partners? They are as yet largely untested in that sense. They have a limited capability to sustain operations, basically because of people, logistics, and intelligence. And they do have continuing combined and joint operations of C4ISR structures and political cognition. And there are existential force and national sustainability issues beyond defense, primarily the number of people who are able and willing to join the forces. But Japan is facing great climate, social, and strategic challenges, and the JSDF were and remain, and possibly even more so will be at the front line of all of these security challenges facing Japan. So I will end there, which means I've been speaking for almost 30 minutes, because I would much rather hear other people's voices and opinions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mulloy, for your wonderful presentation. I apologize for the transitions.
No.
But I would like to begin the Q&A portion of today's presentation by asking, so you mentioned about the fact that obviously because of the population decline in Japan, we're seeing, less and less young people joining the Japanese self-defense forces. So to try and obviously there's only so much you can do with regards to that, but in order to try to, I guess, increase recruitment to a certain extent, is there some type of appeal? Or, are the JSDF trying to perhaps, I don't know, offer a joining fee or something, or like in the United States you get like 4 years of education? Like what are the tactics that they're trying to use in order to try to recruit more?
Great question. The tactics, unfortunately, are limited. They're very imaginative in one sense. They're using social media a great deal. An awful lot of social media efforts being put in, using Japan's soft power, animation, anime and manga and all of this. And they're trying to really appeal to students both at high school and at university. But they are very limited in what they can do. They are not actually allowed to offer cash lump sums to people to draw them into the forces, which does happen in other countries. And no, the US offer of free education. The UK doesn't have that. The US has always been at the cutting edge of this recruitment effort, but the Japanese are very limited, and not only are the forces facing problems because of the limited number of young people, but the forces are also facing huge problems because Japanese companies are struggling to get enough people. So just the other day, a couple of major Japanese companies announced that they were increasing their starting salary for university leavers by something like 50 or 60,000 yen a month, which in Japan is a huge jump. So, if you are, for example, a university student thinking potentially about joining the forces, you're looking at extremely hard work to join the forces and then to qualify and then to gain if you were commissioned, to gain your commission, and a salary of possibly 200 to 250,000 yen a month, or a much easier life with potentially higher social kudos, earning 300 to 350,000 yen. So the forces are facing a huge problem. One of the greatest motivations for people to join the forces is this public service ethos. And all Japanese public services are going to face these problems. The police, the civil service, health services, education, they're all going to be facing them together. And we could end up that they are being outbid by private companies offering more money.
That's very challenging.
It's a bit bleak. I would add, sorry, my particular view is that Japan should redeploy its forces in the sense that the ground self-defense forces are by far the largest. It possibly could redistribute recruitment and reduce the ground forces, plus also increase the reserve forces. But Japan, the 2022 documents, I referenced the three of them, had almost nothing on recruitment, on retention, and nothing on reserves. Why Japan doesn't increase its reserve forces? There are a variety of issues there that would take too long to explain, but it seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think with the kind of neighborhood that you mentioned, it's definitely necessary to prioritize, increasing the forces. And I also wanted to know, in addition to that, so it seems like sometimes the Japan Self-Defense Forces, they tend to do work that might be like that is not distinguished amongst, perhaps, like, say, for police,
Yeah.
So obviously the police, they have the ability to arrest and things of that nature, but natural disaster efforts and things of that nature, do you think that perhaps that might be something that they can do better about distinguishing themselves from perhaps the police or other public servants, and that, like, the military is this is this is the job, this is the role,
Yeah. I actually think that the forces, particularly the ground self-defense force, does a very good job at that. Actually, the ground self-defense forces, they use their disaster relief work as part of their advertising, because this is very clearly for those people who aren't so interested in military affairs, or those who feel uncomfortable about it. They will not feel comfortable about the idea of helping Japanese people in times of disaster. This is the greatest recruitment effort they could have. Strangely, the naval forces have always been more popular in Japan, and the air self-defense force, the maritime self-defense force. But the Navy is suffering because the sense that young people don't necessarily want to sign up to be away from home for long periods of time, this sense of isolation, is something that the Navy are finding challenging. And the Navy don't have this same ability to say, okay, we are engaged in disaster relief. Of course, they do disaster relief work, but not to the same degree as the ground forces. So each of the forces has to find some ways to find sort of traction, as it were, with young people in Japanese society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mulloy, for answering my questions.
No problem.
So some other questions from the chat. So Vivian Ning asked, JFDF's contributions to disaster relief became a major factor driving recruitment after 2011. However, there are people who join the JSDF only to subsequently realize that disaster relief is but a minor part of the JSDF's mission. What are your thoughts on the use of image of disaster relief for recruitment and its impact on subsequent personnel retention?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good issue. If you sign up thinking it's going to be one thing, you find out it's quite another. You think you're going to be doing disaster relief and you're actually, on exercise in Okinawa, storming a beach. It does seem a bit different, but I don't think it's a problem using the recruitment to attract people to show interest in the forces. I think the difference is not just to attract interest. It is actually how the recruiters themselves provide information to those who join the forces, and also those who are doing the training of the forces. One of the great things about the self-defense forces is they have a strong statement on the ethos of the forces, and if you read it, it reads like a liberal arts social science program. It is really incredibly liberal and enlightened. It's amazing. And that is a very good thing about force culture. The problem is that a lot of the jobs that are, of course, the training roles that they undertake, it isn't easy to reconcile those immediately. So it is essentially how the officers and the NCOs in charge of training and also in charge of running the units in the regions need, I think, to work harder on the education of the personnel that they have after training. And one of the major issues when people talk about investment in the self-defense forces, I always get a bit frustrated because people talk about, Aegis and missile systems and things like this. The best investment they could put into the forces is the investment in the education of their personnel. If you invest in the education of your personnel, you get better personnel and you get people who are more highly motivated to stay within the forces. This has been my experience. A lot of people leave the forces thinking, well, I don't see the point. But if you feel that you're in a pathway of development in your career, including not just deployments, but also education, you feel that there is a sense of progression, that you are developing as a person. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. So the next question comes from William Yale. Professor Mulloy, have you seen any commentary in Japanese speculating on how the JSDF would sustain itself logistically during wartime, especially given Japan's vulnerability to attack? Does anyone talk about relying on the US as a base?
Yes and no. There is a strong sense that Japan needs to rely upon the US, and every now and then Japan has a little bit of an existential spasm about whether it will be able to rely upon the US. I'm not making a political point, but when someone such as Donald Trump starts talking about reducing forces or even withdrawing forces from Korea and Japan, this sets people's nerves jangling. Is the US still a reliable ally? Of course, the answer is yes, it is. Far more reliable than any other one could imagine. But the sense that Japan has very capable frontline forces and yet would have very limited capability to sustain itself in a conflict due to personnel and logistics. This is something that is not well spoken about in broader society, nor in political circles. You do get politicians who do talk about this, but these politicians are not in positions of power usually. Two politicians I will pick out from two different parties are Ishiba and Maihara. And these two on opposing parties very much have addressed these issues in their writing and speeches. But I won't say they're voices in the wilderness, but they are certainly not in the mainstream of either of their respective parties. I'd say a good example is looking at Israel, where Israel is supported by the US. There are forward deployed depositories of weapons that are available to Israel. And a similar situation exists in Japan with US forces Japan. But the difference is that Japan has a security treaty and US forces are essentially expected to help defend Japan, not just with equipment, but with units and personnel, and to take the risks for defending Japan. That is well understood within Japan. And one would imagine that most Japanese people would feel that it's time for Japan to do more for itself, and yet that's not necessarily the case. Although what I will say is 2015, Prime Minister Abe put a raft of legal measures to reform security legislation forward that were in most cases quite mild, but it was called war legislation. The reaction was much stronger than the actual intent of the law reforms. But you had mass demonstrations across Japan for relatively mild reforms. Whereas, December 2022, the government announces, oh, by the way, we're almost doubling the defense budget and we're not telling you how we're going to pay for it. And the reaction was a little bit of bafflement and bemusement, but no major demonstrations, I think most people in Japan, as you said, Amani, they look at the rough environment, the rough neighborhood, and they're thinking, actually, I think Japan needs to do a bit more. And if they do increase defense spending to 2% of GDP by NATO standards, that will be a good first step. But the question is, how are they going to pay for it? There still is no plan for this. And can they sustain it? But the same questions also face NATO countries as well.
Very interesting. I think you would think that perhaps with all of the conflict that is currently going on in the world, you know, maybe that has inspired, or that has kind of been sitting in the back of, you know, the Japanese citizens' minds in regards to perhaps, you know, it might be good for Japan to, you know, consider about defense more seriously, and not be so afraid of, you know, preparation in the instance that something does happen and Japan is directly involved.
Yeah.
The next question comes from H. Kawamura. So Japanese politicians want civilian control of the JSDF, but do not want to take civilian responsibility. Would you explain it to some extent in detail?
Okay. I could explain in great detail, but it would take an hour. I will try and make it short. The Cold War, the three forces developed three separate defense plans. And civilian politicians seem to be completely ignorant of this, almost completely ignorant. Interestingly, at that time, defense officials within the JDA were cognizant of this and tried to ameliorate the worst consequences of that. But you come forward to, I don't know which one to choose. For example, Aegis Ashore is a good example. We had a very good defense minister at that time of Aegis Ashore, but unfortunately, Mr. Cornell, but unfortunately, the defense ministry seemed to be completely incompetent. They chose sites that they had insufficient data on that would not fit the operational parameters of that system. And their inability to engage local communities was striking, so that it all ended in embarrassed chaos. And the forces were not directly involved in this. But it makes you wonder what civilian leaders, either officials or politicians, are doing. But it also shows an example of people generally have a NIMBY attitude. NIMBY, not in my backyard. People don't want to have a base near them, in the same way they don't want to have a nuclear power station near them or a wind turbine, but they want to have electricity. So what's the solution? And people want to feel secure. And unfortunately, one of the things that has happened is that Japan has, in many ways, relied upon the people of Okinawa to share an undue burden of both Japanese and US force basing in a very small area, while the rest of Japan has got very limited exposure to such bases. So I would say that's an area of civilian irresponsibility, but also the desire to have relatively low taxes, a relatively small defense budget, although in global terms it's a large defense budget, but in terms of GDP, but also the unwillingness of citizens to participate in the forces or in some other measures that contribute to security. Sorry, the chime again. And the lack of recruitment is one, but also the lack of interest in the reserves. The reserves are under strength, which is about recruitment, but it's also they are under-resourced by the forces themselves, and they're under-prioritized by politicians and officials. So I would say that this isn't just one thing or one aspect or one part of the country, it's a whole pattern. But I think perceptions are changing in this. Whether perceptions will change enough and quickly enough, I don't know, but perceptions, I think, are very much changing.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Gil Elliott. What do you think is the appetite amongst politicians and the Japanese public for more expeditionary or preemptive interpretation of Article 9 as it specifically relates to JSDF cyber activity? Also, is the JSDF allowed to let non-citizens join and or employ PMCs or other contractors to augment the force?
Okay, very good detailed question. I'll break it down into 4 parts. Expeditionary operations, very little appetite. But if you include expeditionary, meaning first strike capabilities, Japan is developing the capability for that by acquiring missiles. But one thing I will refer people to is the statement from Prime Minister Hatoyama, the first Prime Minister Hatoyama, back in 1955 or 6, which was that Japan reserved the right to strike at ballistic missile bases in other countries, even when Japan had not been attacked, if those bases were being used to plan an attack against Japan. That statement came within 2 years of this SDF being founded, when they had no ability to strike. And that basic statement by the Japanese has remained unrevoked. And it has been repeated by people like Ishiba when he was defense minister, by Abe when he was prime minister. When we move on to cybersecurity, Japan has no appetite for offensive operations with cybersecurity, but with cybersecurity, the dividing line between offensive and defensive is much more vague. It's a very fuzzy line. The Australians have gone onto the offensive in terms of cyber defense. The Japanese not yet. The Japanese do employ civilians in cyber security and defense roles within the Ministry of Defense. Japan has got very little appetite for private military companies, PMCs, either within Japan or overseas. And the key thing for Japan is it sees the problems that other countries have. The UK, my country, is a good example, that there are a lot of ex-British forces who become involved in conflicts in various parts of the world. And by association, the country becomes involved, the UK becomes involved. Japan doesn't want that, although Japanese private individuals have worked for PMCs, and one of them at least was killed in Iraq. The area where there could be room for PMCs is possibly in terms of counter-piracy, or in terms of broader maritime security on the less military side of maritime security. So, for example, it could be environmental aspects of maritime safety and security. There'd be room for private companies, not military companies as such. But that obviously moves into more of the workload of the Japan Coast Guard rather than actually the Maritime Self-Defense Force. So overall, I would say a limited capability. Is Japan going to launch some sort of expeditionary operation anytime soon? No, there is no need. And the only expeditionary operations they're looking at are within the boundaries of Japan, like the Nansei Shoto Islands going between Kyushu and towards Taiwan, but not into Taiwan. I would emphasize that.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Jeff. I'm curious, what does the average Japanese recruit look like in 2024? In the US, we often see folks joining who are living in difficult situations or don't view college as an option. Of course, there are also many who join out of patriotism. What about our average JSDF recruit? Any commonalities?
There are some. The biggest one is the biggest ones rather are about region. It's an oddity that the regions that used to provide Imperial Japanese forces with their rank and file personnel are still the ones that contribute the most. So you're looking at regions like Tohoku, Kyushu, Hokkaido. When it comes to officers, Tokyo provides very few rank and file personnel and a great many officers. So you are looking at the metropolitan elites are, to a degree, still dominating the commissioned classes, whereas the rank and file are coming from the less prosperous regions. But when it comes to a typical recruit, it is very difficult to say. There are a lot of people who don't have the money to go to university, for example, and the National Defense Academy is very competitive to get into, not least because they choose the most capable students from around the country, some of whom could not afford university, but they get a 4-year university education and a degree. Some of them choose not to join the forces, and this was a bit of an issue. It's a minor issue, but it's a bit of an issue, but the majority then do join the forces. But I've met a huge diversity of people who, for various reasons, have wanted to join the forces. For example, there was a very unusual case of a major in the ground self-defense forces who was not an engineering officer, but he had a master's degree in engineering from Keio University, one of the top universities, like the equivalent of an Ivy League university. So wherever you find a pattern, you'll always find anomalies. But yes, people who perhaps don't have so many options in the region where they live, but also there's a sense of public service, and certain regions have got traditions of providing people for public service in the forces. So that's as much as I would say, probably.
Thank you so much. Dr. Mulloy, we have quite a few questions, but because we're running out of time, I'll ask one final question, if that's okay. So Manuel Mudini asked, do you think the JSDF is ready to support the US in case of a crisis, for example, a Taiwan contingency?
Great question. And of course, the answer is, I don't know. But because I don't know, that means probably most people don't know. The question here is about capability. Are they capable of supporting the US? Yes. The Maritime Self-Defense Force are the most closely coordinated branch of the forces with their partner US force. So since 1954, they've been very closely coordinated with the US Navy, with the US 7th Fleet, and the fact they're both based in Newcastle. The technologies available, the capabilities available are not only easily combined, but also Japan has got capabilities to make up for limited US capabilities, such as diesel electric subs, which are good in shallow waters. US Navy's got deep water nuclear subs. And minesweeping capability. The Japanese have got a niche capability in minesweeping, which the US Navy doesn't have in this region. They don't need it because the Japanese have it. So they fit together very well. But there's another issue of capability, and that is the capability to actually plan for a contingency and then to carry through your plans. And that is the great unknown. Whether Japanese civilian leaders will wish to commit to any form of support operation, one step removed from actual frontline conflict to support the US, or indeed whether they would be willing to be more deeply engaged within a Taiwan contingency conflict. The ability of the Japanese to talk about this, to think about this, the willingness to do so has massively increased over the past few years. Ironically, Mr. Abe was seen as the hawk, but after Mr. Abe, under Mr. Suga and now Mr. Kishida, this narrative has developed tremendously. And it's an unknown, but I would say that the likelihood is far greater now than it was even 3 years ago. That's probably as much as I could say.
Thank you so much. Thank you once again, Dr. Mulloy, for your presentation today and taking out time from your day to be with us. I want to apologize again to our audience. We had a lot of great questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them today, but I thank you so much for your participation. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation, New York. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you will join us again next week for the next Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Mulloy, for your wonderful presentation and for answering or the majority of our questions. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me. And also thank you for all the support that you've given. And thank you for everyone for joining.